We asked for it and Sony has delivered. With the upcoming Firmware 5.5, PS4 Pro owners on 1080p displays get a new super sampling feature. It's a simple on-off toggle in its video settings menu, but it aims to address one big frustration I've had with the console. So many games from Metal Gear Solid 5 to FIFA 18 have come and gone where 4K TVs get a high resolution mode from the machine, whether that's 1440p or a native 4K. Now that's all great, but supposing you have a regular 1080p display connected with these games, you just get a locked 1920 by 1080 regardless. Let's take games like Rocket League as an example. Attaching a 4K display to the PS4 Pro there, you gain access to a clean 3840 by 2160 picture. According to the developer, this uses checkerboarding, but it's imperceptible in motion. More importantly, Rocket League gives Pro users a great upgrade over a base PS4, and this should have benefits for users of 1080p displays too, in the form of super sampling, a brute force form of anti-aliasing that clears up the game's jagged edges. But for some reason, this high resolution only kicks in with that 4K TV attached. Anything less and you're stuck. That goes for other big games like FIFA 18 too. Ultimately, for 1080p screen users, the resolution matches a standard PS4. And for anyone like myself buying a PS4 Pro to see improved visuals, it's a real disappointment. It leaves a swathe of players with minimal, if any, gains. With the upcoming Firmware 5.5 though, a solution is in place that gives the control back to the player. This super sampling toggle does one basic thing. It tricks any game into thinking you have a 4K display connected, triggering that higher native resolution mode once it starts, along with any other visual changes. Now from there, the console simply scales those results down to your 1080p display. Now this comes with all the pros and cons you might expect. In Rocket League, for example, the game renders at a 4K higher resolution by switching off motion blur and ambient occlusion. So with SSAA enabled, you get a vastly improved image on the one hand. I mean seriously, it's a colossal step up with this feature enabled. But inevitably, you lose those two visual features in the process. Crucially, the option is available to us to make that choice ourselves, though the issue is clear. A big snag to this approach on PS4 Pro is Rocket League's trade-off between visual settings and resolution is still undocumented. The developer has set out two modes of performance on PS4 Pro, but it involves going into the system menus to choose which you get. Worse still, communication of these enhancements is absent, whether that's 4K rendering or ambient occlusion in the 1080p mode, and that goes for several games. Sony's approach here is something of a quick fix for those in the know. People like you and me who see it all compared in videos and know what we're getting without the game specifically outlining it. But while it's handy for us, it doesn't solve the root problem for the general user. What we really need is an in-game toggle to decide between those two modes, fully annotated. It works for Rise of the Tomb Raider, for example. Having to navigate to the system menu to turn this super sampling mode on and off, depending on your game to trigger different results, isn't ideal. Still, with all that being said, I'd call it a welcome addition overall for PS4 Pro users. It does ensure that any and all 4K support previously locked to Ultra HD screens now translates into SSAA downscaling on the Pro's 1080p output. It addresses a genuine grievance users of Sony's enhanced console have had for some time. After all, although it's a bit of a fiddle, 4K display users could always switch their consoles to 1080p to get those full HD exclusive game modes. But until now, the opposite path simply wasn't possible, at least without resorting to expensive hardware scalers, like HD Fury's Linker. It also takes the sting out of some of the worst case scenarios we've seen. PS4 Pro users with 1080p displays got a really bad deal with Assassin's Creed the EZIO collection. It's a collection of Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood and Revelations, rendering each game at a locked 30fps at a super crisp native 4K. However, inexplicably, if the PS4 Pro is attached to a 1080p display, the pixel count locks to a full HD only, a quarter of the resolution. There were no performance upgrades here for running at the lower res. It's the same locked 30fps, meaning that it's a downgrade, plain and simple. By enabling super sampling in Firmware 5.5, the software again believes you have a 4K screen connected and the system takes over from there, downscaling the image and producing beautiful anti-aliasing in the process. The improvement to image quality is clear. Jagged edges are smoothed over, while flickering is reduced in motion on sub-pixel detail, something that comes across best in motion. The new mode puts choice in the hands of the user, which can only be a good thing. Now this means a lot to players clearly. If you'll remember, Naughty Dog's Last of Us Remaster launched with super sampling support on PS4 Pro, which was then removed in a subsequent update to tighten 60 FPS performance for 1080p Pro users. Thankfully, SSAA support did return eventually, along with the ability to run all those modes on all screens. But if users had the support offered by the new Firmware 5.5 back then, system-level SSAA would have done the trick just as well. In fact, I even compared The Last of Us's inbuilt downsampling versus the new system software implementation, and the results are pretty much identical. It's not all plain sailing. Again, this new mode does need to be treated with caution, especially when you consider the frame rates on some 4K modes. A classic example is The Last Guardian, one of the earliest games with Pro support. It's a title that locks a low resolution, high frame rate option exclusively to the 1080p output. Meanwhile, 4K users get a less stable, higher resolution mode. So if you use 5.5 super sampling option in this case, you will get improved image quality, but it comes at the expense of frame rate. And at its worst, The Last Guardian's performance in 4K can drop to the 20 FPS territory. Put simply, given the choice, I'd opt for a straight 1080p here, with no super sampling checked. It's far from perfect, but it's the smoothest way you can play the game right now. A similar example is Call of Duty Black Ops 3, which features a native 1080p mode with enhanced performance and a high resolution mode locked to 4K displays, which again doesn't offer a stabler frame rate. Forcing super sampling in this case swaps in the lower performing high resolution mode, which may not be ideal, especially in a game like COD where the performance is so key to the core experience. And then there are the 1440p titles like Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, and even Dishonored 2 as well. Finally, 1080p screens can access this high resolution mode once SSAA is enabled, but in these cases it's not necessarily a major upgrade. In fact, in still shots, Metal Gear Solid 5 looks a touch blurrier than a native 1080p owing to the scaling on both axes. In motion, there's no doubt running at a higher 1440p res helps with the shimmer and other temporal artifacts, but the game already had a strong post-AA pipeline which gave a decent image, and factoring in the scale to 1080p, the upgrade may not be worth it for some people. Again, the need for a 1440p output mode from the PS4 Pro itself would do wonders here, something Xbox One X does have planned in a future update. Given the prevalence of this resolution on PS4 Pro, having support for this output option would help hugely. Other than that, the option to force SSAA is a positive move, and caveats to this approach are minor. One small nuisance is that text and HUD overlays also get scaled down in the process, where a game might deploy its 4K assets on the assumption an appropriate display is connected. The resulting scale to 1080p operates at a system level, adding a touch of blur to these elements, something you don't typically see with a native 1080p HUD, but that's really it. Comparisons with Xbox One X's implementation are inevitable, and while the new super sampling mode for Pro users is useful, it's still something of a quick workaround. Microsoft's approach by comparison is simple. The system doesn't expose to developers which displays attached to the console. This forces game makers to offer in-game options for all modes, regardless of whether a 1080p or 4K TV is attached, and 1080p super sampling is automatically taken care of at a system level. It is the ideal setup, and the one we've advocated since we saw Dishonored 2, the first game we tested back in the day, to reserve a higher resolution mode for the 4K mode only. My hope is that the Xbox approach will set the standard for all titles on both enhanced consoles. It just makes sense for users to know what options are available, and for all game modes to be available to all users, regardless of what display they might happen to own. The trend is certainly moving in this direction, though Metal Gear Survive's beta code once again sees separate modes that kick in depending on which display output is selected. If that remains the case in the final code, it shows that Firmware 5.5's SSAA mode will always be a useful fallback option. That goes for not just existing games, but future titles too. But again, the communication of features is key here, and why Xbox One X is much more streamlined. With Sony's system, I still don't know what I'm getting or missing when switching between 4K or 1080p modes, at least without running a Digital Foundry level analysis on all modes, or in some cases finding a blog post on the developer's site. I'm really hoping that changes in the future. Meanwhile, it took us a while to get it, but SSAA support is in for all PS4 Pro users, regardless of display, and that'll do for now. Anyway, that's enough from me. If you did enjoy this analysis, do let me know with a like or subscribe. And of course, the source file to this video is available on our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net. But until next time, thanks for watching.